Thank you for agreeing to doing this. I appreciate it. You're probably wondering how I got to know you. I first came across you with, I think it was the interview you did on Backgap with, I've forgotten the name of the guy, Rick Archer, that's right, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I think it was that way around, so I think I first watched that. I think I saw the one with Natalie Gray first, yeah, and then yours. And then I think it was then I bought your book, Living Non-Duality, the first one. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was quite a long time ago now. And since then, I've watched your other videos on YouTube. And I thought it would just be a really nice idea to talk with you.
Mm-hmm. Good. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I got interested in non-duality in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. I'm 40 years old now, and I think the first bit of non-dual literature that I read was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Mm-hmm. And I think at the time, I suppose I was attracted to it because I was suffering in a way. And I suppose that was when the internet was becoming a pretty big thing at the time. And so I was going online looking for answers as to, how can I be happy? How can I enjoy life rather than feel a sense of suffering and struggle? And so that's how I came across that book. And that was just like a gateway, really. And then I got into Nisargadatta and reading about Ramana Maharshi and all kinds of spiritual literature and videos and talks and everything. And it's something that I've not really stopped being interested in. It's just I don't spend all of my time reading about it, but a significant amount of time I spend reading and watching and thinking and contemplating. And so it's something that I don't know, I can't, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to let go of, and so I guess that's a little bit of a summary.
Mm-hmm. Good. So what are your conclusions from what you've studied?
Well, my conclusions. I see that there's a lot of disagreement among spiritual teachers about what enlightenment is and about what it can do, and for example, the divide between traditional Advaita and Neo-Advaita, whether practices are needed, whether practices are not needed, all those kind of things. Another thing is when it comes to whether non-duality can make a person happy, I think that it goes back to this. I think probably one of the central things that you mentioned in your video on the fundamentals of non-duality is coming to a place of equanimity where you're okay with everything as it is, right?
Right.
Which doesn't mean you're not going to have painful times in your life. It doesn't mean you're going to just always be on cloud nine. It's not going to be that way, but it's about being okay with everything regardless of the struggle and regardless of the pain, right? Mm-hmm. So I've written down before, like earlier on today, I wrote down a few questions that I wanted to ask you. Perhaps we could come to those later. I think, I don't know, there's a whole world of things. All I've said so far is just like a small fraction of things that go on in my head and all the things that I think about it. And there have been times where I felt very close to just being very okay with everything. And then there have been times when that will just falls out the window and I get very stressed out and like life gets difficult again. and then I go back to my literature and I read and I become calm again. And and the other thing is like whether I have encountered enlightenment. I don't think so. So I understand all the propositions that all make sense to me in my head. Whether I have come to a state of, well, just like a life of accepting everything and being okay with everything. There are moments for sure, but not on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about your questions that you have written down?
Okay. So I wrote 3 questions down here. Number 1 is, when you reach that sense of equanimity and being present with what's present, is that a decision to be made, or is that something that is just a byproduct of seeing the non-dual position?
Why don't you read the other 2 questions, and it may be.
Okay, so sure. The second one actually relates to the first one. So Eckhart Tolle's principal message is to accept whatever is appearing in the now. Tony Parsons says that this is bullshit because it can't be done and because it assumes that there is someone who could do the accepting. What is your take? What is your take on this conundrum?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Go ahead.
Sure. Okay. And then the third one, is being okay with whatever's present something to be continually reaffirmed, or is it a one-time thing? It's just like an amazing moment and that's it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Well, I think probably it is a one-time thing, in as much as we come to what's called self-realization. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine, Robert. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So the matter is coming to clarity and then living or operating out of that clarity. So yes, that would be essentially a one-time thing. On the one hand, self-realization is, we might say, an instantaneous matter. It's a matter of a realization, realizing something. To realize means to make something true. But once the realization is present, there's the matter of getting accustomed to it, or adjusted to this shift in perception. So that takes time, in the sense that from the standpoint of self-realization, we kind of review all the things that we've seen or known before in light of this new perspective. So more or less the answer to the final question would be that this is an instantaneous realization that once realized we grow into or live into, we might say. Neo-Advaita is just another way of speaking about deepening one's understanding of Advaita. Advaita is not two. A means not in Sanskrit, and Veda means two, not two. So Advaita, or self-realization, is a matter of coming to a place where we recognize or see that there's only one actuality in existence. In other words, there's just one unbroken movement that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And once we understand that, then there's a as we continue to contemplate it, there's a deepening of what all that means. For example, in Advaita, we speak of the relative material world, that is the world of duality that we're all accustomed to. And that's generally contrasted with what I would call the absolute, which is that which you might say stands behind this world, or that this world is essentially immersed in, you might say. But as we understand that, and we come to see that all things are the absolute, and that the appearances are merely appearances, they're not the reality, then we might begin to explore the question of, well, what's the nature of the absolute? And in looking at that, we would probably come to the conclusion sooner or later that the absolute really represents no thing, or nothingness. So, so you might say, if you want to speak about Neo-Advaita, that would be what really is in these terms is called ajata. Ajata, A means no, no, and jata means creation. Ajata means no creation, nothing from the start. So ajata is kind of the deeper aspect of Advaita, and you might call that Neo-Advaita if you want. From your own standpoint, though, what questions are there in terms of self-realization? In other words, you said that you are not self-realized. What is the tell me more about that. What there is to be realized.
All right. So I get that everything is the absolute.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that. Well, if we look at it from the physics perspective, all matter is just energy, and it's all made of the same underlying stuff, right?
Right.
Electrons, protons, neutrons, it's all the same stuff.
That's right.
But it just appears in different forms. And I can see that the sense of self is just generated by the brain as an evolutionary as an evolutionary strategy for keeping an organism alive, for keeping humans wanting to stay alive and trying to survive. But it's a brain area that if that is switched off, then the sense of self is no longer there. It's kind of like it's not something that's actually real. It's just a sense, right?
That's right.
So I can see that. But I don't know if seeing that is meant to come with a feeling. Like I suppose if in seeing that the sense of self is supposed to drop away, I don't know if the sense of self does necessarily just drop away because it's being seen. I think Tony Parsons suggests that there is an actual feeling, like an energetic shift that happens when somebody becomes self-realized. And I don't know how that is brought about just by thinking about it or by discussing it verbally. I don't know how that is done. If it needs to be done, if it needs to be done at all, or even if it's just a matter of if it's meant to happen in a particular person, then it does, and if it's not, then it doesn't, and it doesn't matter what they do. There's nothing that can be done about it. It's just a matter of I don't know, who's to say why it happens in a particular person or why it doesn't in another. I think there are a lot of people who are doing practices and meditation and all kinds of making a huge amount of effort to try to become enlightened, and they spend a lifetime doing so and it doesn't happen. And then there are other people for whom it just happens without them even having heard of non-duality. And so I think, well, I don't know, like, I know that you spend a lot of time in the Redwood Forest contemplating these things because it was like a big interest for you. I don't know whether you would say that it was because you spent that time in the forest, whether that was causative or whether it had nothing to do with that. It just happened for you anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, I spent 3 years in the Redwood Forest because essentially I didn't have anybody like me to talk to. Self-realization is, in Buddhism, they would say a mind-to-mind transmission. And the mind-to-mind doesn't have to be person to person. It can be a consequence of reading, as it was in my case.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, when the clarity is there, it's clear that it's there. The point is that generally we're standing outside of what we're looking at, what we're looking for. So there's the idea that there's me on the one hand and what I'm seeking on the other hand. Obviously, that's duality. So from that standpoint, from the standpoint of there's me and that, with a capital T, meaning the absolute, we try to approach that with the question of how do I bring these two things together?
Mm-hmm.
So that is you might say, a self-defeating question to start with, because the point of these teachings is that you and that have never been apart.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's the nature of the recognition. The nature of the recognition is I am that, as Nisargadatta titled his book. So when we recognize that what we're talking about when we speak about the absolute is something that all the literature, all the sages and so on have described as without beginning and end, infinite in space, eternal in time. If we look at what that would mean something that is ever present, everywhere, at all times, under any circumstances. In other words, there's nowhere that it's not. And that, as the Vedas put it, that means that it's not only external to you, but it's also internal to you. In other words, that which is without a beginning or end, which is infinite and eternal, would not be a form like all these other forms that we presume we see. It would be formless. Being formless, there would be no boundaries, barriers, or perimeters to prevent its presence anywhere under any circumstance. So that which is sought is, as they say in the literature, you are what you're seeking. That what you're seeking is already your true nature. So that's the nature of the realization. The realization is I am that. Not only I am that, but all things are that. Everybody else is that. Everything else is that, because this is all pervading. There's no point in time or space where this is not present. So that's the nature of the realization, and therefore it also tells us that this has nothing to do with time. It's not a matter of I'm here at point A and I'm going to try to get to point B at some time in the future. The point is you are already at point B when you're at point A. Time has nothing to do with it. So it's simply a realization that I am what I'm seeking, and that's
Okay. But wouldn't that mean that if I am in a state of confusion and there is no clarity here, that is also that. So
that's right.
There doesn't need to be a sense of clarity.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, David Godman titled a book about Ramana, "Be As You Are," using a phrase of Ramana's. So the point is to be as you are. In other words, you are that. So therefore, no matter what you say, do, think, or feel, it's that doing what it does. So when we come to that understanding, then it doesn't matter what we say, do, think, or feel. It's that doing what it does. When we come to the place where we see that, then all the ideas we have about these things disappear from the mind, and then we're seeing things from a different perspective.
Okay, indeed. So I think in non-duality as a field of interest, there seems to be this idea that it's going to it's going to solve all your problems. Your life is going to become so much better. You're going to feel great all the time. And I think that is part of the seeking. Part of the seeking is to try to feel better. So would you say that it's nothing to do with that? It's all about, even if you feel terrible, that is okay. That is still what is happening. That is still what you are, and that is no different from feeling amazing. It's still all that anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
I think people are looking to I don't know, to heal themselves, or they're looking to feel good. They're using their search for enlightenment as a way to make themselves feel better about their life. But I think that's a confusion. It's so from what you were saying about how everything is how it is and it's fine as it is, it would mean that there should. It's searching for something that's not actually. It's not actually about finding the answers to all your problems in life, or about feeling good. Right. Is what I'm trying to say. That's right. Would you agree with that?
Yes, like I say, when the point of view is finally that all that is that, then when we recognize that that's the case, then if we were to look around at each of these forms that we see and say, what is the true nature of this form, we would have to say that although it appears to be, a chair or a table or whatever, the true nature of all of these things is the absolute. And that would include these human forms. So when we see that all that is that, then that, if there's only one thing, where can problems arise? Follow what I'm saying? In other words, for there to be a problem, there's me on the one hand and a problem on the other hand. But if I am that and the problem is that, where's the problem? See what I'm saying?
There are no problems.
That's right. That's right. So that's the place we come to. We come to a place of peace of mind because we're no longer in turmoil about these things, and freedom of behavior because we're not critiquing our behavior any longer. So from that standpoint, you might say that's an improvement in one's life. In other words, if a person is in turmoil and so on, then peace and freedom are you might say positive benefits. But the major point is to see all things as this absolute in its manifestation. And in that, to recognize that from that standpoint, there are no two things. There's not good on one hand and bad on the other, right and wrong, better and worse, should be, should not be. See what I'm saying? So in other words, we transcend those ideas, which those ideas are what you would call becoming. We have the idea that the situation is this, but it should be that. It should become something that it's not, right? So that's the idea that we have. And it's not about self-realization. It's not about becoming anything. It's about being simply as it is, without anything
else. Okay. First, thank you, Robert. It's great to be able to talk to you about this. So as I was listening to you talking about that, a question appeared in my mind. So let's say you have somebody who is in turmoil. Maybe they've just been diagnosed with a terminal illness and their life is falling apart. They've become homeless. Everything is horrendous. If they were living in non-duality, would you say that they would simply just allow that to be and to be okay with the turmoil and the chaos, knowing that it's all just that happening anyway?
Right.
Or so do you personally ever have days where things go wrong and you feel stressed, but behind that you feel okay with that stress?
That's right. That's the point.
You have that. Okay.
Yeah, that's the point. From the standpoint of self-realization, in other words, once that shift is present, nothing in the external world changes. All of this remains exactly as it's always been.
Yeah.
It's just that our perspective on it and how we relate to it is what changes. So, these organisms need food, clothing, and shelter, and so on. And so, as a matter of self-survival, we're obliged to relate to the everyday relative world on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, even a sage answers to his name and pays his bills.
Yeah.
So, there are things about the human body living in this so-called world that are, you might say, facts of life, but the main point is how seriously do we take all these things? In other words, death is a good example. How seriously do we concern ourselves with the matter of life or death? These teachings tell us that there's no beginning and no end. There's no life and no death. And once we recognize the true nature of the absolute, we recognize that there is no beginning and ending to that. There is no life and death from the standpoint of the ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the changes that self-realization can bring about.
So something that is in my head at the moment is it's incredibly liberating, because it means that you can't go wrong. You can't make a mistake. It doesn't matter what you do. Exactly. It doesn't matter what you do. Exactly. You can go on a massive goal-setting spree and try and run a business and do what you want. You can lie around on a beach all day, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's all that.
We're all going to close our eyes for the last time, and we're all going to be in the same place, and that place is this emptiness. So there's going to come a time when you won't even know you've ever lived, let alone what you did or anybody else did or what the world did or any of those things.
Yeah.
So this apparent life in this apparent world is empty. It's empty right now. It's empty of, as they would say in Buddhism, inherent existence. In other words, it's not real from the standpoint of what is real. What is real doesn't change, and that's the absolute. It's always ever present exactly as it's always been. But what changes is not real in comparison to that. So you come to the place where you see this as an illusion or a dream. It's like living in a dream. Um, and just like an actor on a stage, you go ahead and play out the role that seems to be presented for you. But
Sure.
beyond that, how seriously should we take all this? Not at
All
all.
right. I like that. Yeah, because it means that you can have fun with the dream if you want to, but you don't have to. You can. Well, if you can take it seriously if you want to, that's also a possibility. There are just unlimited possibilities. But obviously, you have your own nature as a personality and your own likes and dislikes, a lot of which is not by your choosing. So yeah, it's strange because I watched your video on the fundamentals of non-duality, which I've watched many, many times, um, and talking to you now, it just seems to be hitting home more now in a one-to-one situation where I can ask you questions. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm just more engaged because I'm thinking and talking to you and listening to you. It seems to just be hitting home a lot harder than it has been. Mm-hmm. So I'm most grateful to you. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Nothing matters.
That's right. Nothing really matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, but with this shift in awareness, one's values change, and therefore one's behavior changes. So, although it would appear, as you said, that one has the capacity for all number of things, which is essentially true, what we actually find ourselves engaged in is more limited by nature. In other words, when we're no longer thinking in terms of like or dislike, or pleasure or pain, and so on, our life uh, adheres to you might say, a fairly narrow uh, range of things that are appealing. In other words, that our behavior is directed towards.
So do you mean in the sense that we're no longer chasing after goals in order to find fulfillment because it's already here?
Well, yes.
Right.
Yeah. In other words, yeah, things like ideas, opinions, and things of those sorts fall away. So we're not engaged in a lot of you might say wild speculative activity that we might have been engaged in before. You can see this in the lives of the sages. In other words, look at people who are self-realized. What do they do once they're self-realized? Essentially, all they do is spend their time attempting to be of service to people who think they're suffering. Follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. In other words, the clarity leads to a narrower sort of life in terms of actions and behavior than one might think.
Mm-hmm.
In Buddhism, they speak of action without concern for outcome. So that that limits to some extent what the actions would be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're making me think of Ramana Maharshi now.
Yeah.
Who really, whenever I describe his life to anyone, I think, well, it's unbelievable that somebody could be so happy to sit in a cave for years on end, allowing their body to be eaten by insects, and just sitting there and just being totally, and also having no romantic partners in his entire life.
Right.
That's really quite something. That's really quite something.
Well, even when he got out of the cave, essentially, what did he do? I mean, essentially, he took walks and was present for people. That's essentially his whole life.
Yeah.
It's not very appealing to many people who are really committed to living in the world.
Sure, hedonistic lifestyle.
Yeah. It doesn't appeal in that case.
Yeah. And so, in your own experience, do you spend a lot of your day with no thoughts going on in your mind? Do you have a very quiet mind?
Yeah, thoughts are not a problem, but the thing is that when we empty out of our mind all the ideas and so on that we have, uh, essentially we come to a place that's called no mind or an empty mind. But there are still things to be considered in our day-to-day living. In other words, the survival of the organisms. Uh, so, that kind of thinking is still there. In other words, you might call that practical thinking. But the other stuff has disappeared.
Sure. So. Okay. All right. I'm just. It's obviously I'm interested in talking to you about the topic, but I'm also curious about the way your life is actually undertaken because of the self-realization you've had, and it's just interesting to see the effect that has had and how you live on a day-to-day basis, living the actual non-duality.
Yep. Yeah, it's a matter of moving from the known to the unknown. In other words, the known is what we experience in our dualistic perspective, and moving to the unknown is moving to self-realization, unknown because we don't know what to expect exactly, or what our life will be like. So for many people, that idea of moving from the known to the unknown creates fear and things of that sort. But if you were to ask anyone who is self-realized to compare their life to their previous life, I can't imagine anyone saying that they would have preferred their life of confusion.
Right. Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah. How often do you do a one-on-one discussion with people like this?
Like you?
Yeah.
For you? Well, the thing is, I don't have a computer, so it's difficult for me to arrange these Skype talks, and I just do it because people sometimes insist on it. But I talk I talk a lot with people who come here to see me, but I also talk a lot with people on the telephone. So if you can find an inexpensive way to make telephone calls, that's the best means for me, because I do have telephone.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Oh, another thing that came to mind. When you meet a person for the first time, you were talking about having opinions. So when you meet a person, do you have an internal thought stream going on where you're thinking, oh, okay, this person is like this, or I don't like what they said just now, or is it just empty? Is it just quiet?
No, but like I say, thoughts aren't a problem.
Yeah,
In other words, there's nothing we need to do in terms of controlling thoughts.
sure.
It doesn't matter what arises. Whatever arises on the screen of consciousness, it's going to be there for a while. It's going to disappear and be replaced by something else. This goes on all the time. So objectively, we observe what's taking place on the screen of consciousness without concern for what's taking place. One thing I wanted to mention before was that when you were talking about another subject, that sincerity is a matter that is involved in self-realization. In other words, if a person has a sincere desire to get to the bottom of the truth, then that's likely to happen. So I just wanted to add that because it occurred to me.
Sure, absolutely. Another thing that I've come across before is there are some people who say that that there are cases of people awakening who they're not really aware that they have awoken, or they're so subtle that they don't even realize it. Mm-hmm. And there are other cases where it's just crystal clear and it just happens in a big flash and it's like an instantaneous thing. Would you say that the process? Well, I mean, you said earlier on that it's not a process, that it's a one-time. It's just a moment where it's just seen, right?
Right.
But would you say that there is an apparent process where somebody seems to become more and more interested in the subject, starts to research more, becomes more and more interested, and then it finally ends in a moment of clarity? What would you say about the differences in the way that people come to this?
Well, the situation you're describing could be the case, but it's the case because what's to be seen hasn't been clearly seen. If it's clearly seen from the start, then it's a realization. The term is self-realization, self with a capital S, meaning the absolute, realizing the nature of the truth of the absolute. Once that's seen, it doesn't have to be perpetually on the tip of your mind. If you're chopping vegetables or something, you're paying attention to what you're doing. But once it's seen, it's like anything else you've seen. If you've been to Paris, you've been to Paris. So and if you're a male, you don't have to be constantly reminding yourself you're a male for fear that you'll be a monkey. So once this is seen, it's clearly seen, and all the other stuff doesn't need to arise. But it could.
Okay. What if somebody sees it? Have you known of anybody who has come to see this and then who has subsequently stopped being able to see it and gone back into confusion again?
Well, it's not a matter of, in other words, once it's seen, it can be denied. In other words,
right.
I was sitting at a table with somebody at a coffee shop, and we were talking about this, and we got to the point where he could see what I was saying, and he said, I don't want any part of it. So there are some people who have commitments or obligations or something, and they're fearful that such a change in their life might have, tremendous effects on their life and so on and so forth. So you can deny what you've seen, but the fact is, once you've seen it, you've seen it, and short of denying it,
Sure.
it's not
Sure.
going to go anywhere.
Sure.
It doesn't go anywhere because it didn't come from any place.
Okay. And then another thing that's on my mind, Robert, is you know Elon Musk, the Tesla director.
Mm-hmm.
He has been on like interview shows where he has been saying that he believes that there's a 1 in a billion chance that this reality is not a computer simulation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
As in, the idea is that with the advancement of computers and the technology of graphics and CPU power and all those things, right? Mm-hmm. That it's, we're only a matter of time before virtual reality is indistinguishable from actual reality, right? And therefore, it's quite possible that this reality is nothing more than a computer simulation, and that we're just not able to see that because we're in it, right?
Yeah.
I wondered what you could say about that, because it relates to the question, so okay, everything is that, this is all one, this is all the absolute, right? But how did this come about? Is it just a complete mystery? Do we just say, okay, we have these tiny little minds which aren't able to understand this? Do we just say, okay, it's all a mystery and it's just, okay, it's all the absolute, but how did this come into place in the first place? Or do we apply our minds scientifically to trying to understand why is reality like it is in the first place? Why is there even a reality at all?
Well, as I said before, when self-realization is clear, then the mind eventually moves toward what is called ajata. And again, ajata means no creation, nothing from the start. So the deepest truth is that there's nothing real. Not anything is real. And when you really understand that, you understand that even emptiness as an idea is not real. In other words, the idea is not real. So when you really see all of this as empty at best, these kind of questions are pointless. They have no relevance, no significance to anything.
Okay.
Nothing is really important.
Right. So that puts a whole different perspective on it.
On everything.
Because that would mean that it doesn't matter whether asking the question as to why any of this is here.
That's right.
Doesn't matter because it's not even there anyway. It's not even real.
That's right. You come to the place where no questions arise. Questions and answers are dualistic to begin with, but you come to the place where there are no questions arise.